The sun had already slipped low over the Texas plains when the trucks rolled through the gates of the camp. The air was thick with heat, dust, and silence, the kind that comes when people are too afraid to speak. Inside the back of one truck, 40 exhausted women sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces streaked with dirt from a journey that had carried them across an ocean and a war. They had been nurses, radio operators, factory workers, servants of a Reich that promised glory but delivered ruin. Now, they were prisoners in a land they had been told was barbaric, a land of enemies who would show no mercy. The guards who opened the tailgates were young Americans, faces sunburned beneath their helmets, eyes sharp but strangely gentle. They did not shout. They did not strike. They only gestured, calm and wordless, for the women to step down one by one. The women obeyed, moving like ghosts through the dust. Each carried the weight of disbelief that she still breathed, that she stood on American soil, that her captors spoke English, not vengeance. At the camp's entrance hung a sign painted in plain white letters: U.S. Army Internment Camp. Beyond it stood rows of long wooden barracks, neatly built and framed by barbed wire fences that shimmered in the late light. The women noticed something odd: flower beds, real flowers. Someone had planted marigolds along the mess hall wall, and small patches of clover grew near the laundry shed. The air smelled faintly of soap, diesel, and fresh-cut wood. It was not the hell they had been promised. The first night was the hardest. They were given clean sheets, rough but fresh, and a meal that none dared eat at first: beans, cornbread, and a slice of apple. Many waited for a trick, a hidden cruelty, but none came. Only the steady footsteps of guards outside and the far-off hum of a generator breaking the silence. When lights went out, the whispers began. They spoke softly in German, afraid, incredulous, half laughing through their fear. "Did you see them?" one voice murmured. "Those soldiers, the Americans." Another whispered, "They look like movie stars, like in the films before the war." A ripple of nervous giggles moved through the barrack. It was absurd, yet strangely comforting, to compare the enemy to something familiar, something from a lost world of cinema and youth. In the dim light of a single bulb, they remembered the films that had once played in Berlin's smoky theaters. Clark Gable in his uniform, Gary Cooper's quiet strength, Spencer Tracy's easy grin. And now, through the haze of defeat, those faces seemed reborn in real life, wearing khaki and carrying rifles, but with none of the hatred their own officers had promised. They smiled, one woman whispered. One of them even tipped his cap. Another said, their teeth were so white, it was impossible. The camp at dusk looked almost peaceful. A few American soldiers smoked near the motor pool, leaning against jeeps, laughter floating faintly on the wind. To the prisoners, those sounds were alien. Laughter that was not cruel, voices that carried no hunger for punishment. And for the first time since capture, a few of the women felt something unfamiliar: curiosity. One of them, Elsa, a former nurse from Hamburg, stood at the window of her barrack, fingers pressed to the wooden sill. She watched a young guard walk by with a flashlight swinging at his side, his silhouette framed against the wire and the stars. He could not have been more than 20. When he passed, he nodded politely to the guard in the next tower, the gesture slow and ordinary. Elsa's breath caught. That small civility, that unremarkable human motion, was enough to unravel the world she'd known. For years she had been told Americans were monsters. Yet here he was, a boy polite enough to nod to a comrade under the moon. That night, as cicadas sang in the dark, the women lay awake. The whispers returned, not fearful now, but puzzled. almost wistful. They spoke of home, of the men they'd known, soldiers broken by the war, faces hardened by ruin. None of them looked like these men. "It's like being in a dream," said Margaret, her voice barely above breath. "A dream where the enemy looks like an actor from another world." She didn't mean it in vanity. It was disbelief wrapped in awe. These American guards, with their confident gait and calm eyes, seemed carved from a kind of moral distance. Untouched by hunger, untouched by defeat. To the German women, they represented everything the Reich had claimed to despise and secretly envied. Ease, abundance, a freedom that radiated even through uniform seams. In the far corner of the barrack, an older woman crossed herself quietly before sleep. "Maybe God is here too," she whispered. No one answered, but the silence that followed was no longer hollow. Outside, floodlights glowed softly on the wire, casting long shadows that reached across the camp road. From the guard tower came the faint crackle of a radio playing swing music, foreign, forbidden, yet gentle as a lullaby. The melody drifted through the night, seeping through the cracks in the walls, through the layers of fear, through the brittle remnants of pride. And so, in that unlikely moment, surrounded by fences, watched by soldiers, the first fracture of ideology began. It was small, quiet, unnoticed even by those it touched. A single seed planted in disbelief, that the enemy could smile, that kindness could live even here, that the world might be wider than the war they had been taught to worship. The whispers lingered until sleep came, carrying with them the first fragile realization that captivity might not destroy them. It might, impossibly, teach them to see. Morning arrived not with shouting, but with the sound of footsteps, clean, measured, almost soft against the packed earth outside the barracks. A bugle sounded in the distance, not blaring in menace, but marking a rhythm. This was a military place, after all. But it was not their military. And this rhythm did not feel cruel. It simply was. The German women rose slowly, still unsure if the previous day had been some elaborate trap, a lull before humiliation. But the sheets were still clean, the doors were not locked. And when they stepped outside in rows, the habit of order still clinging to them, they were met not by screaming guards, but by a sergeant with a clipboard and a voice like gravel soaked in sunlight. "Ladies," he began, nodding once, "you'll be assigned to labor shifts by your skill. Nurses, typists, farmhands. We'll sort that later. First, breakfast." And that was it. No sermon, no threat, no barking, just an offer. Breakfast. They marched in uncertain silence to the mess hall, where long wooden benches lined a room that smelled of coffee and warm starch. American soldiers passed them by, not gaping, not mocking. One or two even nodded in brief greeting. The German women sat across from one another, eyes flitting from trays to faces, fingers hesitating over metal utensils, as if unsure whether they were being offered food or tested. Then came the boots, polished, creased, laced tight, not German boots, not jack boots, but U.S. Army issue service boots worn by soldiers who strode like they had never needed to prove themselves. The German women noticed them immediately, not because they were flashy, but because they weren't. The men who wore them didn't stomp, didn't swagger. They walked with a calm that wasn't arrogance. It was something else, something bred into them. And that walk, steady, relaxed, upright, was the walk of men who had never knelt. To Margaret, who had seen too many boots crush too many voices, this was the first dissonance. She could not stop staring at them, not out of fear, but out of fascination. The boots told a story, not of superiority, but of stability. Not of fear-driven command, but of a world that never had to be shouted into existence. At the head of the mess hall, two American guards stood side by side, chatting quietly. They were clean-shaven, arms folded. One of them, a tall soldier with dark hair slicked neatly beneath his garrison cap, laughed at something the other said. And that laugh, open and unguarded, made more of an impression than any uniform could. Across the table, Ingrid whispered, "They laugh like it means nothing. Like war hasn't touched them." "They don't look broken," said Elsa. "They look like they belong in photographs. American ones." The idea sounded foolish, even as it left her lips. And yet, it spread. One by one, the women began to see it. The way the men held their shoulders, the way they leaned casually on door frames, the way their shirts clung to frames unbowed by defeat. These weren't the faces of victors gloating, nor were they the cruel grins of conquerors. These were the faces of people who came from a different kind of world. One not built on ideology, but on ease. One that had movies and magazines and dances. And no rubble. That day, the women were assigned to work crews, laundry, kitchen duty, basic camp maintenance. None of it was harsh. They were given gloves, mops, brooms, buckets, soap that smelled faintly of lemon, clean water and warm when the pipes permitted. For Anna, who had grown up scrubbing blood from cold floors in a Berlin hospital during the raids, it was the warmth that undid her. As she rinsed a wool blanket in the steaming water, her hands shook, not from exhaustion, but from the memory of cold. In that moment, a corporal passing by paused. He watched for a moment, then stepped forward and wordlessly handed her a rag that had slipped. No sneer, no lecture, just a small kindness, so ordinary it felt revolutionary. Later, back in the barracks, the whispers came again. But they were different now. Less about how the Americans looked, and more about how they behaved. "They didn't leer," one woman said. "They don't touch," another added. "And they smell clean, not like smoke and fear." A long silence followed. Then one voice said what no one dared admit aloud until then. "I think they pity us." No one answered. But the truth of it hung in the room like heat, undeniable, suffocating, and yet not cruel, not mocking. Pity, not as insult, but as recognition. The kind of pity one feels for a wounded bird or a neighbor who lost everything in a fire. It was not superiority. It was survival, standing across the fence line. As the sun dipped below the Texas sky again, the light bent long through the wire. A group of guards played horseshoes near the administration hut, their laughter low and idle. Inside the barracks, Elsa sat near the window again. She no longer pressed her face to the glass. She simply sat, watching, thinking. Perhaps it was the way the light softened the edges of the compound. Perhaps it was the warmth of her now dry socks. But something had shifted. The enemy no longer looked like a beast. They looked human. And to a woman who had built her world on the certainty that all enemies must be monsters, that realization struck harder than any prison gate. The sun rose softer the third morning. Not in the sky. It was still the same brutal Texas sun, slicing across the rooftops and barbed wire with a white-hot glare. But in the hearts of the women inside Barracks 4C. The fear had not vanished, but it no longer dictated every breath. Instead, there was something new. Something delicate, curiosity. It showed first in small ways. A longer glance held at breakfast, a cautious question whispered between work shifts, a folded sleeve adjusted before stepping outside, as if, absurdly, someone might notice. The German women had begun to observe their captors, the way one watches a strange bird, warily fascinated by its colors, its ease. They noticed the Americans didn't all look the same. Some were tall and lean like film actors. Others were broader, hands calloused, skin browned from the sun. Some had southern accents thick as syrup. Others spoke with clipped northern crispness. But what stunned them most was not how they looked. It was how they acted. Corporal Frank Mallory, blonde, boyish, always humming tunes while unloading supplies, had become a quiet mystery to the women assigned to mess duty. He wasn't beautiful in the classical sense, but there was something about the way he whistled swing melodies while scraping burnt beans from the bottom of a pot that made them watch. And then there was Staff Sergeant Will Landers. Tall, square-jawed, with a slow stride and a quiet, almost priest-like demeanor. His voice never rose. When he gave orders, it sounded like a favor. One morning, he held open the mess hall door for 2 POWs carrying trays stacked with mugs. One of the women, Anna, was so startled she nearly dropped hers. He simply tipped his head. "Mom," he said, "Mom," and let the door swing closed behind them. Back inside the barracks, the story spread like contraband. "Did you hear what he said, ma'am? He called me that once, too. I thought he was mocking me. But he wasn't. No, he meant it." Soap became another symbol of fracture. The powdered kind the Americans issued, chalky, cheap, but strangely fragrant, began to feel like gold. One day, Elsa ran her hand over her wrist after washing and found her skin smooth for the first time in years. She stared at it like it didn't belong to her. It was Ingrid who put words to the unease in their hearts. "They take care of us," she said, "but not out of duty, out of habit, like they don't know how to be cruel." Elsa shook her head. "No, they know, but they choose not to be." That difference, that terrifying, beautiful difference, was what unsettled them most. It wasn't that the Americans didn't know the world was cruel. It was that they lived as if cruelty had no place in their identity. And so, the comparisons to Hollywood returned, but this time not just about looks. "They move like actors," whispered Margaret one night. "Even the way they carry trays or walk across the yard. It's like they're performing ease, like they don't even know we're watching." She wasn't wrong. The German women, raised on Reich propaganda, had been taught that Americans were soft, arrogant, spoiled, decadent weaklings hiding behind machines. But now, watching them in real life, the truth hurt. They weren't weak at all. They were confident, at peace with themselves. The guards laughed easily, but didn't gloat. They shared cigarettes with each other, not out of scarcity, but camaraderie. And more than once, the women saw a private help another soldier up after tripping or offer his canteen on a hot day. These were not things you did for show. They were habits, reflexes. And habits told the truth of a man's soul more than speeches ever could. One morning, during a laundry shift, Elsa reached for a bucket at the same time as Corporal Mallory. Their hands brushed. She froze, unsure whether to recoil or apologize. He just smiled. Not with flirtation, not with pity. Just a smile. Warm, harmless, human. That night, Elsa could not sleep. The memory of that smile, how gentle it had been, haunted her. It had felt like something stolen from before the war, from a time when the world had made sense. In the bunk above her, Anna whispered into the darkness, "Do you think, if we were American women, they would dance with us?" Silence answered. Then came another voice. "I don't want to dance. I just want to be seen without shame." That was it. That was the root of it. Not romance, not vanity, not even safety. It was dignity, restored not by words, but by gestures. A nod, a door held open, a smile given without demand. And it unraveled something deep inside. These were not the monsters they'd been told to hate, and the women who had spent years under the boot of propaganda, survival, and fear, now found themselves dangerously close to something even more terrifying: admiration. Because to admire your captor was to question everything. By the fourth week, the camp no longer felt like a cage. It still had fences, guards, and rules. But those things had lost their power to terrify. What the women feared now was subtler, quieter. It was the unraveling of everything they once believed about who they were, who the enemy was, and what the war had meant. Every morning followed the same rhythm: reveille at dawn, work assignments at breakfast, and the long, sun-blasted afternoons spent mending uniforms, folding sheets, or scrubbing the tiled floors of the infirmary. The work was simple, but the silence around it was charged, like something immense shifting beneath the surface of everyday gestures. Elsa worked in the laundry tent that day, her hands raw from steam and soap. Across from her, Ingrid sat on an overturned crate, sorting linens by size. They didn't speak much anymore about the Reich or about Germany. The words tasted foreign now, heavy with betrayal. Instead, they talked about the little things: the scent of American soap, the texture of cotton sheets, the way the guards' uniforms never seemed to wrinkle no matter how hard they worked. Outside, Corporal Mallory passed by again, humming the same tune, a fragment of Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. The melody floated through the air, winding between the tents, softening even the hum of the generator nearby. Ingrid stopped folding. "He hums that every day." Elsa smiled faintly. "It's like he's not really here, like the war doesn't live in him." "Maybe it doesn't," Ingrid whispered. "Maybe they've forgotten it already." Forgotten. The word lodged in Elsa's chest like a splinter. Could people really forget so easily? Could they step out of war as if out of a shadow, while she and her sisters were still learning to breathe in its aftermath? Later that afternoon, Elsa carried a basket of clean uniforms to the fence line, where two guards waited to collect them. One was Landers, the quiet sergeant with the still eyes. The other was a new recruit, younger, barely 19, his face too smooth to have seen real combat. Landers greeted her with a nod. "Thank you, miss." That word again, miss. Every time they said it, she felt a strange flicker of shame and comfort colliding inside her. No American had called her that before. It was too gentle, too polite. She wanted to reject it, but something inside her refused to let go of the warmth it carried. As she handed the basket through the gate, a sudden gust of wind lifted her hair. One strand brushed against Landers' hand. He didn't move away. He just looked at her, not with hunger, not with authority, but with a quiet recognition, like one human being acknowledging another. For a moment, it was as if the barbed wire didn't exist. And then, just as quickly, he turned, set the basket down, and walked away. No words, no gesture. Only that silence, heavy and holy. That night, the whispers returned, thick with confusion. "Did you see the way he looked at her?" Margaret said from the upper bunk. "Not lust," Anna murmured. "Respect. I haven't seen that in years." In the half-light, Ingrid laughed softly. "We are prisoners of men who respect us." It sounds like madness. No one argued. The idea itself felt revolutionary. That one could lose a war, yet be treated not as spoils, but as souls. Days passed. Then, one afternoon, the camp commander, a short, wiry man with a face carved by sun and patience, gathered the women near the mess hall. Through an interpreter, he explained new privileges: an expanded work garden, a small library of English books, and the right to write letters home. The last one drew quiet gasps. Letters to home. For some, there was no home left. For others, The word alone reopened wounds they'd sealed shut for survival. Yet, when the paper arrived, smooth, white, smelling faintly of ink and hope, every woman wrote. Elsa's hand trembled as she began. Dear Mother, I am alive. I am in America. And they are not what we were told. They are kind. They are... She paused. How could she explain kindness from those she had been taught to hate? How could she confess that captivity had shown her more humanity than the empire that raised her? Outside, a truck engine started. Someone laughed. The scent of coffee drifted through the barracks, rich, almost sweet. Life moved on, indifferent to ideology. Later that evening, as the sun burned red behind the guard towers, the women stood outside in the yard for roll call. The light washed everything in gold, the wire, the boots, even the dust rising from the ground. It was in that light that Elsa saw them again. Landers and Mallory, standing near the gate, speaking in low tones. Mallory gestured toward the sunset and said something that made the sergeant chuckle quietly. It was such a normal moment. Two soldiers sharing a joke about nothing. Yet it made Elsa's eyes sting. She turned to Ingrid. Do you ever think, maybe they'll remember us too? Ingrid looked up. You mean after? Yes, Elsa whispered. After this, after we're gone. Ingrid thought for a long time. Maybe, she said softly. But only if they saw us as people. The bugle sounded. Roll call ended. As they filed back to their barracks, Elsa glanced once more toward the fence. Landers was still there. The last light of day caught his profile, and for an instant, it looked carved from amber. Not an idol, not a conqueror. Just a man, watching the same sun sink behind the same horizon. Inside, as the lamps flickered on, the women sat in silence. The whispers were gone tonight. Only breathing, slow and human, filled the air. The fracture had widened, not into rebellion, but into awakening. For the first time, Elsa prayed not for release, but for understanding. There was no mirror in the barracks, not a proper one. Just a strip of polished tin nailed to the wall near the wash basin, warped and clouded, reflecting faces in ripples and fragments. The women used it in the mornings to tie their hair, straighten their collars, or, more often now, simply to look, not in vanity. In search, Elsa leaned over it one gray morning, studying the reflection that stared back at her. The face was thinner than before, lips chapped, sun beginning to brown her forehead. But her eyes no longer carried that narrow, glassy glare born from obedience and fear. Something behind them had begun to soften or break. Outside, the camp was stirring. Bugles, boots, shouts. A delivery truck rumbled past the perimeter road. The air was dry, heavy with the scent of dust, canvas, and oil. A normal day, but nothing felt normal anymore. It wasn't a single moment that changed them. No grand revelation. It was a slow unraveling, like threads pulled from a uniform seam until the whole garment came undone. What unraveled first was certainty. Anna was the first to say it aloud. They were seated beneath the laundry shed's slanted roof, folding blankets in the afternoon heat. Anna didn't raise her voice, didn't even look up. She simply said, in a tone so flat it felt dangerous, everything they told us was wrong. No one moved. She placed a folded blanket on the pile. The Americans, the West, they said it was corrupt, sick, animal. But I've never been treated more like a human being than here. Margaret lowered her eyes. Careful. Why? Anna asked. What are they going to do? Send us back to Berlin? It wasn't a joke? Not really. There was no laughter, only silence. Elsa stared at the floor, her hands frozen around a wet sheet. She remembered her teacher in Hamburg years ago, explaining that the world was divided into clean and unclean races, noble and degenerate blood. She remembered posters warning women never to look twice at an American, that their smiles hid filth, that their music, jazz, swing, blues, was poison to the Aryan soul. But Landers had smiled without venom. Mallory's humming was gentle, not corrupt. And the jazz that sometimes floated faintly from the guard shack radio had begun to sound beautiful. "Do you think," Elsa whispered, "that we were the ones who were sick?" That question hung heavier than any accusation. For days afterward, the women moved differently, slower, quieter, not because they feared punishment, but because they had begun to see themselves from the outside. Like actors stepping out of character and realizing they didn't like the role they had played. They watched the Americans more now, studied them, their rituals, their manners, the way they shared a thermos at guard post, the way they took their hats off in the presence of the chaplain, the way they carved names into the back of benches with idle knives. Not slogans, not threats, just names. It was a kind of freedom the women had never known. Not the absence of walls, but the absence of fear. Then came the photograph. It arrived in a care package meant for one of the guards, a thin envelope from home. The women caught sight of it during a break, when Mallory, as usual, leaned against the motor pool fence to read his mail. He held it up to Landers and chuckled. They said something, and then the photo passed hands. A black and white snapshot of a girl, maybe 16, standing in front of a Chevrolet with a dog in her arms. She wore overalls and a bandana, no makeup, hair loose, and she was smiling. One of the German women, Hannelore, a former school teacher, whispered, "She looks like one of us." That simple phrase sent ripples through them. Because she did. She could have been a cousin, a sister, a friend from before the war. The line between us and them was beginning to blur, and with it, the foundation of everything the Reich had built. That night, the whispers returned with a new timbre. No longer curiosity, no longer awe. Now came grief. "I gave 5 years of my life to the Reich," Margaret whispered. "I carried wounded men out of rubble. I saluted photos of men who lied." Anna lay on her cot, facing the wall. "They taught us to hate so we wouldn't ask questions." Elsa said nothing, but her chest ached, not from hunger, from shame. The deepest kind, not of defeat, but of complicity. The barracks felt different now. Not smaller, not larger, just real. No longer a stage for survival. It had become a confessional. And in this space, where their beliefs collapsed like burned-out buildings, the women began to find each other again. Not as comrades in ideology, but as fellow wanderers in a moral wilderness. They spoke more often of home, but not the Nazi home, the real home of lakes, apricot trees, fathers who played cello, brothers who never returned. These memories had been buried beneath uniforms, slogans, salutes. Now they surfaced like bones in spring thaw. Ingrid once whispered as she held a steaming cup of ersatz coffee, "I don't think they hate us." Elsa turned to her. "Why not?" Ingrid shrugged. "Because we remind them of someone." She didn't say who, but in that answer was everything. In the faces of these defeated women, the Americans saw not threats, not monsters, but echoes of sisters, of wives, of the lives they'd left behind. And so, the Americans didn't lecture. They didn't punish. They simply treated the women as human. And that was the most dangerous, most healing act of all. Because kindness, given where it wasn't earned, could break even the hardest walls. It was a Sunday afternoon when the radio changed everything. The chapel tent had been left open, flaps rolled back to let in the breeze. A few POWs swept the floor in quiet duty. Others walked in circles along the fence line, tracing thoughts they couldn't name. Elsa had just finished hanging sheets behind the infirmary when she heard it. A voice, faint and slow, floating through the camp like smoke. It wasn't a hymn. It wasn't military. It wasn't German. It was soft, low, a woman's voice. She turned toward the chapel, where the music was coming from. Inside, Sergeant Landers sat behind a weather-worn desk, an old radio crackling beside him. He wasn't aware anyone was listening. His eyes were closed, chin tilted slightly toward the sun, and from the little speaker came the unmistakable voice of Billie Holiday, pulling every note from a place so deep it sounded almost holy. "I'll be seeing you, in all the old familiar places." The music was like water in the desert, and the moment, the aching sweetness of it, cracked something wide open. Elsa stood motionless, hand still clutching a damp towel. The wind brushed her cheek like a whisper. Ingrid stepped up beside her. "Who is that?" she asked. "An American, I think." They didn't speak again. Neither did anyone else. A quiet hush fell over the yard as more women drifted near, some pausing by laundry lines, others near the mess hall door, drawn to that voice like moths to warmth. Billie sang not like a performer, but like a mourner. Every word felt bruised, lived. Those days of summer, the cafes in the park, it was not propaganda. It was not meant to convince. It was sorrow. It was longing. It was love. In that moment, it didn't matter that she sang in English. The ache was universal. Anna sat on the stoop of the canteen, tears on her cheeks. She didn't wipe them. No one did. Later that day, back in the barracks, the women sat in silence. Not shame, not bitterness, something else. Her voice, Ingrid finally said, it didn't sound like victory. Elsa nodded slowly. No, it sounded like she lost something too. And there it was. The Americans, the men who stood watch behind rifles, who poured coffee and hummed swing tunes, who smiled and tipped their hats. They had lost something too. Not just lives. Something quieter, innocence maybe. And suddenly, they were no longer just captors. They were part of the same war story. Not opponents, but reflections. From that day on, things changed. Not visibly. The gates still locked. The guards still rotated. Orders still came with the clink of dog tags. But in the space between all that, in the glances, in the silences, there was something gentler. The women began to hum, not loudly, not publicly, but in private corners, while sweeping, folding, or stirring pots. Elsa caught herself humming one of Billie's lines under her breath, and when she realized, she blushed. Not out of shame, but because it felt so natural. She didn't choose to hum. The music had chosen her. Even the guards noticed. Private Daniels, a freckled boy with ears too big for his helmet, chuckled one day when Anna unconsciously tapped the side of a wash basin in rhythm. "Careful," he said. "Next thing you know, y'all will be playing baseball and eating apple pie." It was meant as a joke. But the women didn't laugh, because it wasn't as far-fetched as it once seemed. Some of them had begun to dream in English. One night, Hannelore confessed it aloud. "In my sleep, I saw myself wearing a dress like the girl in the photo, and I was sitting in the back of a Chevrolet." Margaret whispered, "What color?" "Blue, with little white dots." The barrack was still. No one teased, no one questioned, because the dream didn't belong to just her. They all shared it, not the car, not the dress, but the possibility. The freedom to imagine a life not dictated by flags, slogans, or uniforms. In the mornings, they stood straighter. Not out of defiance, out of something closer to grace. Landers once said to Mallory, just loud enough for the women near the fence to hear. They carry themselves different now. Yeah, Mallory answered, like they ain't prisoners. And in a way they weren't. The barbed wire still stood, but it no longer defined them. The war still raged far away, but it no longer owned them. They were beginning to see their reflections, not just in that strip of tin by the wash basin, but in the way Americans treated them, in the music, in the silence that followed it. Elsa would later describe that day. The day Billie Holiday's voice played over the radio. As the moment the war inside her ended, not because she surrendered, but because something else took its place. A question, a longing, a truth too quiet for orders, too strong for silence. It was early autumn when the letter came. Not to the women. They were rarely permitted correspondence yet. But to a guard. A letter that should have passed like dozens before it, read in silence, pocketed, and forgotten. But this one did not disappear quietly. Private First Class Raymond Hale was no one special at first glance. Young, wiry, with a narrow face and a limp that said training accident more than hero. He was polite, quiet, and always careful to keep a distance. If the women noticed him at all, it was for the way he never made eye contact, as if ashamed to be seen holding a rifle in front of unarmed women. One morning, during a supply shift, Elsa saw him sitting alone behind the chapel tent. The letter was open in his hands, pages worn at the edges. His lips were moving as he read, not for anyone else, just for himself. She didn't mean to watch him. But there was something fragile in the way his hands trembled. That afternoon, word spread quickly among the barracks. Hale's brother had died in France. Infantry. Killed in a forest clearing by a mine, they said. The letter had come from his mother. There were no details, only the ache of a family unraveling. Elsa felt the news like a punch to the ribs, because it was the first time, truly the first, that the American soldiers weren't just uniforms or shadows. They bled too. They broke too. And now, one of them was walking around with a hole in his chest where a brother used to be. That evening, Hale was posted at the northeast corner of the yard, near the laundry line where Elsa and Ingrid worked. He said nothing, just stood, still as a fence post, eyes fixed on the ground. Ingrid approached first. She didn't speak English well, but she didn't need to. She bent down, picked up a small piece of chalk, and drew a circle in the dust at her feet. Slowly, she tapped her chest, then pointed to the circle. Family. Hale looked up, startled. His eyes met hers, not with suspicion, but recognition. Elsa stepped beside her and added another shape, a small triangle beside the circle. She said softly, "Bruder," then tapped her heart. "Ich verstehe. I understand." He stared at the drawings for a long moment. Then, for the first time since the letter arrived, his mouth twitched. Not a smile, not grief, something in between. A quiet surrender. He crouched slowly, and beneath the circle, he drew a star. Just one. Then nodded. That was it. No words, no lectures. But that one silent exchange traveled like wildfire through the barracks. That night, the women whispered not about soldiers or music or uniforms, but about the letter, about the boy guarding them who had lost someone, just like they had. Anna spoke softly from her bunk. "My cousin Franz died at Stalingrad. No letter came, just silence." Hannelore added, "2 of my students vanished. One day they were boys. Next day they were photos on a wall." Margaret whispered, "I watched my father cry in a stairwell the night my brother left for Warsaw. He never came back. All of them had lost someone. And yet, none of them had ever paused to consider that the Americans had lost too. Because the Reich had not taught them to imagine the enemy's sorrow. Only his strength, his danger, his corruption, but never his tears. The next morning, something strange happened. As the women lined up near the work sheds, Hale approached, this time not as a guard, but as a man. He carried a folded paper in his hand, not the letter, but a photograph. He stopped in front of Ingrid and held it out. It was faded and bent at the corners. A black and white snapshot of two boys sitting on a porch, one older, grinning wide, the other still just a child, holding a fishing pole. "My brother," he said, the words thick but steady. "Eli." Ingrid took it gently, studied it. Then, with solemn care, passed it to Elsa. It moved down the line like a relic. Each woman held it for a moment, said nothing, and returned it with a small nod. The kind that says, "I carry grief too." Yours is not alone. No guard stopped them. No officer interrupted. It was not a moment of policy. It was a moment of humanity. That night, Elsa lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the barrack, her thoughts circling like moths around a flame. She had once believed she would die for the fatherland, that to hate was righteous, that to weep was weak, and that mercy was for fools. Now, none of that remained. Only the memory of a boy with a photograph. Only the knowledge that grief spoke no language, but truth. The next morning, Elsa tied her hair differently, not for vanity, but as a kind of respect. A quiet offering to the invisible bridge that had begun to form, plank by plank, between captor and captive. Later, while sweeping near the chapel, she looked up and saw Hale again. He didn't wave. Neither did she. But this time, they held each other's eyes for 3 full seconds, and it was enough. By December, the Texas wind had changed. The once scorching heat softened into a dry, golden chill. Dust no longer rose in clouds, but rolled gently over the camp's roads like mist. The women wore issued coats now, olive, drab, and coarse, but better than what they had in the camps back home. Some had taken to hemming them, stitching little repairs in private, a quiet reclaiming of dignity. Then came the rumors. It began with a single cardboard box left outside the infirmary. Taped shut marked PX surplus. Inside were bars of soap, canned peaches, socks, even nail files. A guard had set it down, turned, and walked away. Anna opened it. When she saw what was inside, she whispered one word. Gifts. More boxes followed. No one announced them. No officer stood to explain. They simply began to appear. One at the edge of the laundry shed, one by the chapel, another near the mess hall. Always anonymous, always quiet. The women gathered around them in disbelief. Each box contained something absurd. Peppermints, knitted gloves, envelopes of stationery with faint blue lines and gold edges. One even held a tiny, painted ceramic bird. Hannelore held it up in trembling hands. Who would give us this? No one answered. But the answer lived in the camp itself, in the rhythm that had shifted. The guards no longer looked away when the women passed. They nodded. Sometimes they spoke first, and their words, while simple, carried weight. "Morning, ma'am. Cold today. Hope the soup's better than yesterday." The wall between us and them had thinned so much it now shimmered like heat on pavement. Visible, but no longer real. And then came Christmas Eve. That afternoon, the women were told to gather near the mess hall. No explanation. Just a polite order, delivered without force. Curious and cautious, they lined up in coats and gloves, boots scuffed from work, hair tucked behind ears that still strained for a language not their own. It was Sergeant Landers who stepped forward. He didn't shout. He didn't read from a paper. He simply said, "The chaplain asked if any of you would like to attend service tonight. Non-mandatory. There will be music and light." That last word, light, struck something deep. They nodded. slowly, one by one. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the floodlights buzzed on, the women walked toward the chapel. And that was when they saw it. The gate had been left open. Not all of them noticed at first. They were too focused on the glowing lanterns strung along the roofline, on the faint sound of a harmonica playing Silent Night. But then Ingrid stopped in her tracks and whispered, "Look." The fence had not moved. The guards still stood, rifles slung. But the chapel entrance, the side normally secured with a swinging gate, was wide open. No locks, no chains. Just a path. And none of the women ran. They could have. Perhaps, for a moment. But they didn't. Because they no longer felt like prisoners. Inside the chapel tent, benches had been arranged in neat rows. A wreath hung above the makeshift altar. The chaplain, a tired-eyed man in a wool stole, stood quietly behind a small table with a cross fashioned from 2 broom handles. The guards stood in the back, silent, hats in hand. The women filled the front rows. No one was searched. No one was counted. And then the music began. A soldier played the harmonica, and another, Mallory of course, joined with a battered guitar. They were clumsy, off-key but sincere. The first song was "O Holy Night." And though the women didn't know all the words in English, they recognized the melody. They sang in German. "Heilige Nacht, O Heilige Nacht." Their voices rose like smoke, soft, breathless, trembling with something more ancient than politics. Tears fell quietly. No one hid them. Not the women, not the guards, not even the chaplain. When it ended, no one clapped. They simply sat in stillness, holding the silence like a fragile glass in their hands. Then one of the soldiers stepped forward, a boy barely shaving age, and handed the chaplain a bundle of letters. "For them," he said. "We figured maybe they'd like to write home." There were no instructions, no lectures, just that simple offering. The chance to speak to someone far away, to be known again, to not vanish. Each woman was given 1 sheet, 1 envelope, 1 stamp. It felt like being handed a name again. Elsa didn't write immediately. She sat with the paper in her lap, pen motionless, staring at the ink. Then slowly she wrote, "Dear Mother, I do not know who I am anymore. But I know who they are not. They are not monsters. They are not what we were told. They have shown us warmth. They have shown us silence that heals. Tonight, they left the gate open, and no one ran. Perhaps this is what peace feels like. Not banners, not speeches, but the sound of our voices in 2 languages singing the same holy song." She folded it carefully, stared at it as if it were a mirror. Later that night, back in the barracks, someone placed the tiny ceramic bird on the windowsill. It faced outward, toward the floodlights, toward the wire. No one touched it. It simply stayed there, a symbol not of escape, but of return to something older, quieter, a gentleness forgotten by war, remembered by strangers. By the start of the new year, the war was shifting elsewhere, deeper into the Pacific, tightening around Germany, like winter itself. The women at the camp could feel it, even from thousands of miles away. The guards no longer read war headlines aloud. Rumors grew louder than the radios. Cologne bombed, the Ardennes, Soviet tanks near Silesia. But life inside the fence took on a strange quietness. Not numbness, something warmer. A ritual had begun among the women. Every Sunday, they swept the barracks with particular care. They folded their uniforms tighter, tied their hair more neatly, polished their boots with scrap cloth. No one said why. No one had to. Because Sundays meant landers would walk the perimeter slowly. Mallory might stop and chat near the chapel door. And a few guards, especially young Hale, would linger near the benches carved with initials. It had become a kind of performance, but not for attention, for presence. That was the word Elsa had started using, silently to herself. Presence. To be seen, not as prisoners, not as enemies, but as women again. As human. Then came the perfume bottle. It arrived in a package from home. Not to the women, but to one of the guards. Private Daniels, the shy one who hardly ever spoke. He was standing near the motor shed when the box came in, tearing it open with a quiet grin. A few guards gathered to tease him. Letters from a sweetheart, no doubt. But then he lifted something from the paper that stunned them all into silence. A small, elegant glass bottle. It caught the light like a secret. Daniels blushed. "It's from my sister," he muttered. "She said the girls at her school wear it and thought the lady prisoners might, like it. For Christmas." There was laughter, good-natured, but it faded fast, because they all understood what he was saying, and what he wasn't. He wasn't mocking. He wasn't offering a joke. He was offering a memory. The next morning, the bottle appeared on the laundry table, wrapped in a handkerchief, left without a word. No one claimed it, but no one touched it either. Not for hours. When Elsa finally stepped forward, the other women watched in stillness. She picked it up gently, unwrapped it, and held the bottle to the light. A pale amber liquid swirled inside. Not much. Just enough. She uncapped it. The scent hit her like a wave, not sharp, not floral. Soft, powdery, a little vanilla, a little dust. A little ghost of a world that had once included cafes, hair combs, and whispered conversations at coat checks. She blinked rapidly and pressed the bottle to her chest. Ingrid whispered, "Is it French?" Elsa shook her head. "No, American." She passed it to Anna, who breathed it in and closed her eyes as if transported. That evening, the bottle made its way around the barrack, passed with reverence, like communion. One woman dabbed it behind her ears, another on the inside of her wrist. Margaret tucked a drop into the collar of her uniform and said, "I feel like a girl again." And for the first time in months, the women laughed. Real, full-bodied laughter. Quiet, yes, but real. Outside, Sergeant Landers walked past the window and paused. He caught the scent, faint but unmistakable, and turned his head slightly. He smiled. He kept walking. The guards never asked about the perfume again, but they noticed how the women carried themselves differently, how their steps gained rhythm, how they stood straighter during roll call, even joked quietly in German under their breath. Because that bottle wasn't just perfume, it was permission. Permission to remember softness, permission to reclaim something war had stolen. The right to be beautiful. Not for seduction, not for deception, just for themselves. It was Hannelore who said it clearest. One night, she sat by the stove, eyes distant, voice low. "My husband never saw me wear perfume. I saved it for after the war. I thought, when it's over, I will become myself again." She didn't cry. She just stared at her hands. Elsa replied, "Then maybe it's over. At least for us." That sentence hung in the air like the perfume itself. Weightless, fragrant, impossible. Could the war be over in a place with barbed wire? Could peace grow in captivity? Yet every act, every Sunday dress, every quiet nod from a guard, every shared song said yes. It wasn't the peace of treaties. It was the peace of recognition. Recognition that they were not monsters. And neither were the men in uniform watching them from towers. Elsa kept the perfume wrapped in a handkerchief beneath her cot. Not hidden, just safe. And each morning, one of the women would come forward, unspoken, and she would nod. And Elsa would offer a single drop. Just one. Enough to make a memory live again. Outside, the wire still stood, but the scent passed through it like air. It told no lies. It made no promises. But it lingered, like forgiveness, like spring. The letter came in March, typed on thick paper, signed by an officer in Washington. It was posted on the bulletin board outside the command hut in both English and translated German. The women gathered to read it in silence, the words sinking in like frost on the window panes. Repatriation orders issued. Transport begins within 10 days. It was over. Not the war. Not quite. But for them, this strange, silent chapter had found its closing line. The days of labor rosters and laundry buckets, of stolen songs and quiet smiles, were numbered now. They would be sent home, or what was left of home. There was no cheering, no weeping, only stillness. Because how do you say farewell to a place that had both held you captive and given you back your humanity? The women packed in silence. They rolled the few things they had. Blankets, underthings, a hand-sewn doll someone had made from scrap cotton. Elsa folded her barracks coat and placed the perfume bottle inside, wrapped in the same white handkerchief. It had only a drop left. She didn't dare use it. She wanted to carry it with her. Proof that even in war, a woman could still be seen. On the 7th day, a train arrived just beyond the outer gate. A long, low whistle echoed across the plains, lonely and metallic, like something lost calling out to be remembered. The guards lined up in formation, not stiff but solemn. No rifles slung, just hands behind backs, caps tucked under arms. It was not a ceremony. It was a farewell no one had prepared for. The women exited the barracks in small groups. They wore their issued coats, boots cleaned one last time, and carried satchels tied with string. Some had tucked dried flowers in their shirt pockets. Ingrid had stitched a ribbon into her collar. Anna wore a cross made of 2 matchsticks bound with thread. The camp was utterly quiet. No dogs barking, no shouting. Even the wind held its breath. Sergeant Landers stood at the gate, clipboard in hand. When Elsa approached, he looked up. Their eyes met, and for the first time, she spoke to him in English. "Thank you." He didn't answer at first. Then softly, "Safe journey." Behind him, Corporal Mallory stood holding a small canvas sack. As Elsa passed, he stepped forward and offered it. "For the road," he said. "Some chocolate, dried fruit, tooth powder. It's nothing." Elsa took it with both hands. "It's not nothing," she said. She bowed, not as a soldier, not as a prisoner, as a woman to a man who had seen her when she no longer saw herself. As the line moved forward, one by one, something extraordinary began to happen. A hand extended here, a whispered goodbye there. A soldier offering a cigarette, not lit, just the gesture. A prisoner offering a photograph. "Please, keep it. Remember me." The guards did not refuse. The women did not look back, because looking back would break them. Near the last car, Elsa turned once, just briefly. The camp was still, but in the distance, on the chapel steps, someone had placed the tiny ceramic bird. It faced the tracks. She stared at it, heart pounding. A single wind gust stirred its neck ribbon. The train doors closed, the whistle blew, and the fence, that hated line of wire and metal, that symbol of division, fell behind them. Not with a crash, but with the soft retreat of memory. Inside the carriage, the women sat on wooden benches, knees touching, hands folded. None of them spoke. They had too much to hold in their chests, too much that words would only diminish. Hours later, as the land rolled by outside, fields, fences, rivers, Ingrid pulled a folded page from her coat pocket. It was the letter she had written, but never mailed. She read aloud in German, voice barely above a breath. "Mother, I am not who I was. I saw the enemy, and he gave me soap. He gave me music. He gave me silence, not the cruel kind, but the kind that lets you remember who you are. He never raised his hand. He called me ma'am. He let me wear perfume when the world said I was no longer a woman. He opened the gate. And I did not run. Because there was nowhere to run, only something to walk toward. And that was peace. She folded the paper again. No one applauded. But Elsa reached out and took her hand. So did Anna and Margaret. And one by one, the women formed a chain. Not of grief, not of fear, but of return. Not to Germany, to themselves. And far behind them, in a quiet camp under a vast Texas sky, guards watched the empty road. They would remember the women, not for the war they came from, but for the war they left behind. One bottle of perfume, one broken language, one shared hymn, and the unbearable beauty of forgiveness unspoken